Hello, and welcome back to our podcast series, Data Matters, hosted by Summit BIM Consulting. Summit BIM is a consulting company focused on supporting the AEC/OO industry as it transitions from a paper-based to a data-driven process. We're focused on ensuring through clear definition and effective quality control the generation of reliable, structured data that can be used throughout a project's life cycle, enabling checks to be automated through design and construction and facilitating the collection of installed asset information and metadata for handover to FMO teams. So let's get started. Today, Vale and I are going to continue our conversation about ISO 19650. Last month, we talked about OIR, Owner's Information Requirements, and PIR, Project Information Requirements. And this month, we're going to chat about AIR, or Asset Information Requirements. The Asset Information Requirements are a critical part in defining the data and geometry needs of the project from the perspective of the owner, i.e. the group that is paying for the design and construction of their facility, and the operator, the group who will be responsible for operating and maintaining the facility for its life. So let's start with an overview of AIR within ISO. So Vale, if we start thinking about this and defining AIR, how do you think is the clearest way of defining it?
So as per ISO 19650, the definition is that the asset information requirement outlines the data and information needed to operate and maintain a built asset. So the way this goes, it's connected to other documents that like the organization information requirements and the project information requirements. So basically, in the organization information requirements, the owner actually states like the high-level goals that they want to achieve. And then in the project information requirements, the data standards and strategies are defined. And in the asset information requirements, you have like the specific parameters and data points that you need for each asset type. So for example, if you want to track a door, let's say, you're going to know exactly which parameters of data you need to add to that door, and also the level of geometry expected from that asset.
So I guess one can sort of say that by the time you've defined your asset information requirements, you've actually really improved your ability to make informed decisions throughout the life cycle, because you're now being able to use structured information. And I guess It then becomes much easier to run a compliance check to make sure that actually what you've asked for has actually been provided, because you can query the data set and check it effectively. And I'm assuming that all of this at the end of the day is really going to improve the operational efficiency and support preventative maintenance plans so everything's ready for handover. Is that the sort of right way to think of this?
Yes, I think that it highlights like the importance of the asset lifecycle management. So the information that supports assets and operations for maintenance and strategic planning. So these have to be the asset information requirements must be very well defined from even before design start, so that everybody is clear and understands what they need to add to the model at the end of the day.
That's a huge challenge, though, because very typically in most owner organizations, the facility management team, those that are going to maintain and operate, are not really involved in the capital planning stage of a project. So often their needs are not really considered when the RFP goes out for the design and construction. So that's change management.
Yeah, that is one of the challenges that we usually face in the projects. I feel that more often than not, when we are asked to help develop some BIM requirements for an owner, you need that input from the FMO people, because at the end of the day, they are the ones running the building and they are the ones who know what information they need to run the building properly and which are the pain points that they currently have and where delays actually happen, and therefore they lose money at the end of the day, right? So sometimes one of the challenges I found is that it's really hard to get that feedback from the FMO people at an early stage of the project, and owners also struggle to understand what they actually need to ask for. And that leads to another lesson learned, that is data overload, because when someone doesn't really know what to ask for, they by default ask for everything.
Yeah, and that becomes too much. So yeah, it's where is the value in the data that you're actually asking to be generated?
Exactly.
So I guess as we move on for that, one of the challenges again for owners is how do they clearly set about identifying in a sort of clear, concise manner what it is that they're actually asking for, because it's a lot of very complex information, and there's already confusion in the industry because a lot of people think that by asking for, say, LOD 300 provides the information that they need, but LOD is only geometry. And I know we've done a podcast around LOD on its own because of the problems and confusions that it causes. And as an organization, we've spent time trying to define the data and the geometry requirements for design and for construction. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about the DGS and the DCS that we've defined as a means of providing the level of information need around assets.
So I think that's why ISO is like trying to get away from the LOD concept in the standard right now. Like, for example, they don't really mention LOD anymore. They talked about level of information need, as you mentioned before. I think that has to do with the thing that you mentioned before about realizing that LOD was defining the geometry but was not addressing the metadata part of the information basically that you need to put or attach to an asset. So you can still use LOD as a framework for the geometry as a reference. However, you also have to define and very clearly what parameters of information you need to attach to the assets as well as the geometry. So the level of information need is, I think, a broader look to this whole thing, where you have like the geometry on the one side, and you also have the development of information on the other side, because you may have like a cube, which is geometry, LOD, basically nothing, but it might be embedded with very rich information at the end of the day. So the whole concept of ISO, in my opinion, in my understanding, is that you have to be very mindful of what you need to ask, and you have to start with the end in mind to be very strategic about what you're asking for, because if you don't really need a very developed geometry, then why are you asking for it? It takes time for the teams, it takes money, so we need to understand what we're asking for, why we're asking for it, and what uses that information is gonna drive at the end of the day for us, as I mean like the owner, right? So the starting point is before design happens, before design even starts, these requirements must be in place and very well defined. And I would say they have to be part of the request for proposal, so that all the teams, when they sign the contract, are very much aware of the expectation of the information and geometry they have to provide for the owner. So before, when the project is being way before design, actually, the owner must develop these asset information requirements, and they have to engage in the conversation, as we mentioned before, the FMO team, and they have to ask themselves, okay, what information do I need to run my building? The asset information requirement is very much in alignment with the operational phase of the building. So basically, the idea is that you as an owner are going to ask for information that you need to effectively maintain and operate an asset, right?
I guess the other thing we have to bear in mind, though, is that the maintenance and operations of a building, there's also the information you need to actually allow the building to function, not from a mechanical or electrical perspective, but what sort of rooms do I have? What departments do I have? What are the finishes of my room? How do I clean my floors? Where are my hazardous materials stored? Where's my security, high security? So it sort of doesn't just cover an asset that must be maintained like a piece of mechanical equipment. It's a much broader scope, and defining that in a clear and organized specification that is easily digestible for the design and construction teams, and can be used to hold teams accountable, that they have actually complied and generated the information and data that is required at the life cycle is sort of an area that as an organization we've spent time working out how to try and do that in our data and geometry specification and our data collection specification, because the other side of this is, the difference between the design intent asset information and the installed asset information. So at the end of the day, the owner wants to have the holistic data set, which is comprised of both pieces. So that's another piece. And I guess linked to that is, how granular should this information be? And how do you organize it?
Yeah, I think that is also aligned with starting with the end in mind. Depending on the project that you're doing, these requirements are going to be different. Like, for example, if, as you mentioned before, maybe a university for maintenance and operations, they do need the rooms, they do need the spaces, the areas and stuff, but maybe another program does not need the same requirements. So it's really going to depend on the organization high-level goals, and then they are going to be project specific, right? Depending on the project and depending on the input of the facility maintenance people and the things that they actually need to run the building, which is going to be different for different programs and different organizations, right? So the first step, I would say, is to sit down with the owner and include in the early stages the maintenance and operations people, to really understand where is the value or what data is going to bring them value, right? And then once you were able to do that, you can go asset by asset trying to define, okay, what information do I need for this? Do I need information from doors? Do I not need information from doors? Then usually, yes, in our experience, the bulk of the information comes from mechanical and electrical. But then again, that is going to come from that conversation with the owner and the FMO people. And the earlier they are involved, the better, because that way you ensure that you're asking only for what you need and you're not asking for more, right? Which we mentioned this in the previous podcast, but when you ask for more than what you need, you are creating a higher cost for yourself, because the design team is going to charge you for whatever information they are going to create for you, right? So the more you ask, the more the costs go higher, right? The same happens for construction. By data collection, they are going to have to attach warranty certificates and installation information to the asset. So, and then at the end of the day, when you receive that information, you are also going to have to manage that data set. That can be actually quite large, right? So that's why ISO says over and over again that we have to be strategic about the things we ask and only ask for things that actually have value.
Yep, absolutely agree with you. And I guess, the other piece of this is, how does the information management process, as it's sort of defined in ISO, roll into this need to actually check that the information that you've asked for is actually contained within these model data sets and it's not being sort of pushed in from other sources, so that you can have the sort of one version of the truth and actually rely on the structure of this information so it can be used as the basis to move data downstream as opposed to having to recreate it. And I think, one of the things you touched on, but we haven't really dug into, is clearly understanding the structure that the information needs to be in to be able to move into a CMMS system at the end of the day, so that, you understand what you're trying to build and what you're trying to complete, and you know when you've completed it, because you can actually check that all the information that's been asked for is actually present within the data set.
Yeah, so currently the way we do it and the way ISO is asking for, we have two documents, right? You have the project information requirements and then we have the asset information requirements. So the project information requirements is going to establish those data standards, like the naming conventions, the way that data has to be produced, like which acronyms are we going to use, what information is going to be put in each parameter, and so on and so forth. And the level of information need and stuff. And then we have the asset information requirement document, which actually tells you like the parameters that you need and by which point in time you need to provide them. And it's very clear because you have like this for each asset type that you have in the model, right? So you can go in there and know like the expectation for some piece of mechanical equipment, the expectation for some piece of architectural furniture or whatever, or any discipline, right? So the way to develop the information is explained in the project information requirements, and then the asset information requirements is more specific about which asset needs that information, which parameter, and also by which milestone that should be provided. And that is very important for the information management process, because it gives the possibility of to the process to be audited, right? So you have that document that clearly sets expectations for everyone as of by when the information must be present in the model, right? And it gives the possibility to the information manager to actually compare that against the models at each milestone and see if the information is being developed progressively and consistently. Because the idea is to do it that way, progressively and consistently. If we leave everything to be developed by the end, there is a high risk of the information not exactly.
It's just not going to happen. We've been there and we've seen it. So
the more
I guess
that
the
you
other thing
push
to
it,
mention is the cost. If you ask for information that you have no use for, then not only does it cost to generate, it also costs you as an owner to maintain this information during its life cycle. And if you don't maintain it, then it loses its value. So it's really important that you ask for what has value for you. And I know we found, different challenges in sort of doing this process. One of them is being that, facilities is just not involved early enough in the process to define exactly what they want. that there's a data overload because there's a lack of appreciation of the amount of data that is actually generated throughout this process, and sort of filtering it to value is also important. And managing the change management and the pushback that we see from design and construction teams who it's not how they're used to doing it, so they'd really rather not do it. Yes. And finally, I guess the thing is that there's no plan developed in terms of actually how are you going to manage to move this data from where it is residing, whether that's in an interface like we have, RFMI, which is a cloud-based solution, or whether it's a piece of commissioning software or it's another piece of cloud-based software. How are you going to get all the information into a data set with the documentation that's needed, like warranty certificates and operations manuals, and push it into a CMMS system? So, that needs a plan.
Exactly.
A plan needs to be developed ahead of time.
Absolutely. That's something that lessons learned is that you need to have that conversation early on to be able to plan for it, because it might not be as seamless as it looks. First of all, to highlight that it's imperative to have the data in a structured manner, organized in a structured manner. So structured data is paramount to drive this process. But then you need to plan ahead. Like this whole ISO guideline is talking about planning ahead and trying to think about how you're going to do stuff beforehand and understand the needs so that you can have a plan in place. Because when you leave things push, which is something very common in the industry, to leave things for later, for when we get to that stage, we'll see. Then what happens is that everything gets delayed, because when you reach that point in time, challenges occur that you weren't expecting or other, and that just creates delays at the end of the day. Whereas if we do the exercise to try to involve the people earlier, to try to have some answers to these questions earlier, we can create a plan and mitigate the risk of delaying the project even further, right? Yeah. Because the whole point of creating these asset information requirements, along with the project information requirements and the organization information requirements, is to be able to reuse the information created during design and construction, collect the information of the assets that were installed, right? And create those preventative maintenance plans so that we can have a data set ready and working by the moment of occupancy of a building, right? So if we delay the stages,
is when we get to that stage, our asset information requirements change themselves, and they've now become an asset information model.
Exactly.
So that it sort of switches when it actually gets transferred. It becomes the asset information model, which I guess we can talk about another time.
Yeah.
So
with the asset information model comes the importance of the common data environment, right? So it's very important to keep this information once it's produced, like to keep it in a common data environment, so that to preserve its integrity, right? And then you can add information like the installed information can be added into that common data environment, right? To create the asset information model, as you just mentioned. But it's very important to keep that common data environment so that we all know that we have the one version of the truth, and that is it. We don't have to go checking back and forth versions and which was the right one. Is this correct? Is this incorrect? No, we have everything in one place and protected, and then we move forward and we can seamlessly, hopefully, pass it to the CMMS system of the owner.
But before we can do that, we have to have a quality control program in place to progressively check that this data isn't duplicated. It does follow the one version of the truth. It does have all the data fields it's supposed to have, and it is compliant, and that it can be therefore used and moved on. So
that's the importance of the information management process that we were talking about earlier. Like the fact that for the first time in the industry, we have the opportunity to actually check the process and audit the process. And so that, like, also another concept that is paramount in this process is the concept of the transparency of the information. Like, we need to be able to access information during the process and not only at the end. We need to be able to audit it and check. Like, if it's not happening progressively, I can assure you it's not going to happen at all.
It's not going to get there. We've seen that too many times. Okay, well, thanks, Vale. Really appreciate your input. And everybody else, thank you for joining us for this month's podcast. We hope you enjoy this more conversational approach. And if you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, summitbim.com, where you'll find, in addition to other podcasts centered around a data-driven process, several blogs that we have written on this topic. So please feel free to reach out to us and let us know what you think, or if there are any particular topics that you'd like us to discuss. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.